Hello everyone, my name is Paul Roberts and I want to tell you a most amazing story. It's a story of intrigue and illicit affairs that happened over 200 years ago, with changes in names, and it involves the Industrial Revolution in England and military service in India, the last Zulu War in South Africa, and then the greatest diamond rush that ever occurred, and then the gold rush to the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And the identity of the hero of the story and of his parents and grandparents were all discovered using DNA. This is the story of my great-grandfather, Richard Charles Roberts. I have now almost completely exhausted the paper records for my paternal line. There are a few loose ends which would be interesting to look into, but are not vital. I would like to look into the Agostini family. We know that Luigi Agostini came from Lucca, but unfortunately the records for Lucca are not available in the catalogue before the year 1806. But I hope maybe in time they will be acquired, and then I'll be able to review them and find the Agostini history. Another matter of interest might be to find out who Richard Charles Roberts was in the British Army. We know that he abandoned his wife Annie Hensley in Birmingham and joined the army, so chose a different name. And then when he deserted the army, he chose the name Richard Charles Roberts. And the only way I think we may narrow down the search is if I could possibly find the troop lists on the ships from India to South Africa in 1879. I understand there were only 2 ships that took troops down to South Africa. If I could find those troop lists and then find which of those troops deserted after the Zulu War, then I may be able to find who Richard Charles Roberts was in the army. But that's not vital information, so if I have nothing better to do, I'll get to it. This map shows the travels of my paternal line around the world. I will start with the present and work my way back. My dad, Vernon Graham Roberts, died in 2020 here in Texas. And he and my mom had moved here in the year 2000. They came from South Africa, and they both grew up in Rhodesia. My dad was born in Bulawayo, southern Rhodesia. My dad's father, Walter Edward Baden Roberts, spent his whole life in southern Rhodesia in Bulawayo, where he died in 1974, and he'd been born in Johannesburg in 1900. And his father, Richard Charles Roberts, died in Johannesburg in 1929, working on the gold mines. But he had this interesting life where he had been on the diamond mines in Kimberley, and he had deserted the British Army in Port Elizabeth and changed his name to Richard Charles Roberts from some unknown name in the army. And in the army, he had been in the last Zulu War at Ulundi in 1879, and before that in India. And before that, he lived in Birmingham on the Bull Ring. And his name was Luigi Pietro Rolandi, but he went by the name Louis Rowland. And he married Annie Hensley and then abandoned her and ran away, leaving her pregnant. His father, Luigi Rolandi Sr., died in West Bromwich, very near to Birmingham, in 1903. And he had lived in Birmingham for about 40 years with Emma Thomas. His name was actually Luigi Apollinari, but he changed it in Birmingham because he was abandoning a wife and child in London, Rose Vaughan and her daughter Celesta. He had lived in London a few years and then had an affair with Susanna Agostini and took her pregnant to Birmingham, where she gave birth to Richard Charles Roberts, and then he changed his name. And Luigi Apollinari had grown up in Borgo Val di Taro. He was just outside the town, up in the Porsegatone region, and his family had been there for many centuries. They were farmers in the area. Luigi's father was Donati Apollinari, and I have the family traced all the way back into the early 1600s to a Stefani Apollinari, and then the records die out. But we know from the book that the mayor gave me a clip from that the family moved to the area in the mid-16th century from the Gotra region, which is just a couple of miles down the valley. Before this, there are no written records, but there's one other way that we can look at our family histories going way back in time, and that is with the use of Y-DNA. Just a reminder about the DNA. Remember, it's all in the nucleus of the cell, and there are 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, and there are 22 autosomal pairs and one sex pair. And the sex pair consists of an X and an X chromosome in females and an X and a Y chromosome in males. All the chromosomes contain analogous genes in the same position on each chromosome. So the gene for hair color on one chromosome will be in exactly the same place on its partnered chromosome, and of the pairs, one came from the father and one came from the mother. So the X chromosomes are the same. Their genes correspond with each other. The only chromosome that doesn't have a partner is the Y chromosome. And this is what makes it unique. Because it has no partner, it doesn't pair up with any other chromosomes, it essentially passes from generation to generation without changing, with no variation. So this Y chromosome will be exactly the same as the Y chromosome in the parent and in the Y chromosome of that parent. So when it comes to inheriting the Y chromosome, only males have the Y chromosome. It is what makes the embryo male. So women have 2 X chromosomes, one from the mother, one from the father. But all males have an X chromosome from the mother and a Y chromosome from the father. So the Y chromosome, every son will have an identical Y chromosome to the Y chromosome of the father. And that father will have identical Y chromosomes to his brothers and to his father. So it goes back generation after generation. Since there's no mixing and matching of the Y chromosome, the DNA is passed unchanged, generation to generation to generation, down the male line. And this may go on for 50 or more generations. And then there may be one slight little mutation. One father in producing a sperm, there's a slight mutation and one base pair is switched for another in the sequence of DNA. And then from then on, all the sons of that son will have that same mutation. So when we look at them all, we can see there's a whole group of males population with one little mutation from another group. And we can trace them back, mutation by mutation, and work out the family tree of male civilization. This is a confusing slide with lots of little labels and numbers, but you'll see many of these if you're looking into Y-DNA. If Y-DNA replication was perfect, if all DNA replication was perfect, then there would be an identical copy of the father's Y-DNA made in sons. And that would go on forever. So every male on the planet, if they all descended from one original male, one Adam, then every male would have the identical Y-DNA. But there are always errors. Why these happen, who knows? Maybe some exposure to X-rays or solar radiation or any chemical. No one knows. But in time, there will be some error in the replication of the Y-DNA, and it will be very small. Just a few, 1 or 2 or 3 DNA pairs are switched and in different positions. And that results in a different Y-DNA from the father. So that one son produced from that sperm will have different Y-DNA to his brothers and his father. And his brothers will continue producing the same DNA the father had, but all his sons from now on, and their sons, will have that variant in the DNA. And that's what this chart is showing. Those variants, so many with the advance in technology and discovering the DNA sequence, they found thousands of them. So they labeled each one a different odd name, G, J, R, with numbers after, as they discover more and more variations. So father with M9 DNA had offshoots of M61, M70, M74. There were probably other gaps in between that we don't know of. Probably the M9 split into M61 and M9. And then that M9 split into M70. It didn't all just happen in one generation. But these thousands of DNA mutations have occurred, and we roughly guess at when they occurred, because we can have a rough idea of how often these mutations do occur, and then we can work back in time. And some of the more recent ones have been confirmed with archaeological digs and testing DNA on archaeological findings, which can be done in some cases. But a lot of it is guesswork, depending on how often we think mutations can occur. But that's what this chart is showing. It's just a breakdown of how these mutations occurred, and we will be able to trace them. One big group will be the black peoples of Africa. Another big group will be the Asians. Another big group will be Caucasians. So they all trace back to an original ancestor. As those different groups of Y-DNA mutations are traced back and given those labels, we can trace them where they were on the planet. The M group, the G group, the R1b group, and they all seem to trace back to somewhere in Central East Africa. The R1b group are the Caucasians, and the migration of our ancestors over thousands and thousands and thousands of years can be traced. The native South Americans are a Q group, as are many of the North Americans. And they came over from Siberia, etc. And it's interesting to see how all humans are related, the Aboriginals in Australia. And using these Y mutation groups, we can trace our Apollinari ancestors. I had sent my DNA to Family Tree DNA, but I sent my father's after initially sending it to Ancestry.com. I also sent it to 23andMe. And 23andMe gave the Y-DNA breakdown, which confirmed the information I got from Family Tree DNA. And this is the message from 23andMe about my dad's DNA. And it tells my dad that he is of this group, RCTS 6889. And then it just has this little blurb. As our ancestors ventured out of Eastern Africa, they branched off in diverse groups that crossed and recrossed the globe over tens of thousands of years. Some of their migrations can be traced through haplogroups, families of lineages that descended from a common ancestor. Your paternal haplogroup can reveal the path followed by the men of your paternal line. Here is a further breakdown of all those DNA mutations in the yRNA occurring down to RCTS 6889, which is our group, which it would be the Apollinari group, and shows the mutations that occurred in the past and where they came from, going back to around 2500 BC, 8000 BC. RM269 is a big group which spread through Ukraine, heading west into Europe. The RP297, about 13,600 years ago in southern Ukraine, and back to the R1b group, big group in Europe, back to the RM420 or the R1a group, back to the RM173 about 27,000 years ago in Central Asia. Here is another image from 23andMe showing our Y-DNA group. It says the Y chromosome is passed from father to son, remaining mostly unaltered across generations, except for small traceable changes in the DNA. This is important information that we are of this group, and in fact we can trace one of our ancestors was living in Colegno, a suburb of Turin, over 1,000 years ago. Here is Florence, Lucca is here, and Borgoval di Taro is in here, and it is only 100 miles from Colegno. A burial ground in Colegno was recently excavated, and this is the burial ground with showing the bodies that were found, and DNA could be extracted from many of them, and one of those was a male because it's Y-DNA, and he was of the group RCTS 6889. This was reported in an article entitled Longobards Ancient DNA from Pannonia and Italy. What does their DNA tell us, and are you related? And they say, despite centuries of research, much about the barbarian migrations that took place between the 4th and 6th centuries in Europe remains hotly debated. To better understand this key era that marks the dawn of modern European societies, we obtained ancient genomic DNA from 63 samples from 2 cemeteries from Hungary and northern Italy that had been previously associated with the Longobards, a barbarian people that ruled large parts of Italy for over 200 years after invading from Pannonia in 568 CE. So our ancestors were part of that group of Longobards. We can now add some more to our world travels of our Apollinari ancestors. There again is my dad, Walter, Luigi Apollinari Rolandi Roland Roberts, his father Luigi Rolandi Apollinari from Borgoval di Taro, and then we know they were there for a few hundred years, and we know ancestors were in northern Italy, just 100 miles away, over 1,000 years ago. And then using Y-DNA, we can trace them back through the M269 group in the Ukraine, 8,000 to 13,000 BC, the R1b group, M343, in this area. Some migrated this way and others went around this way. And then in the Kazakhstan area, 25,000 years ago, back through Iran, 50,000, 76,000, the RM89, and back to maybe 275,000 BC, somewhere that time period with haplogroup A. That is where our branch of Y-DNA traced. One final amazing thing happened, which I would like to share. I had been thinking about Susanna Agostini leaving her family and going to Birmingham pregnant, giving birth to the baby, and then going back to her family as if she was a single girl, with her maiden name, and getting married, and then having her own family and immigrating to the United States. And I thought that was her only option. She had to have a life for herself, and the baby was raised by his father. And then I thought, what about Annie Hensley, the son of Luigi Apollinari, now Luigi Rolandi? That son of Susan Agostini grew up, got married at 18 to Annie Hensley, then he just abandoned her and ran away, joined the army, and left her to give birth to a baby boy, Louis Peter Rolandi. And that baby boy grew up being told that his mother died in childbirth and his father ran away, and he was raised by his grandfather and the woman he thought was his grandmother. I thought, perhaps Annie Hensley didn't die in childbirth. That had been passed on throughout the descendants down to Michaela in Perth. But maybe she didn't die. Maybe she realized too her life was over. She couldn't get married because she was married. Her husband had disappeared. So she was stuck. There was no way she could ever marry, being married before, and no divorce, and not knowing whether the husband was alive or dead. So perhaps she spoke to the grandparents and said, how about you raise the child for me, and maybe I can get married and have a family of my own? And they said yes. So perhaps Annie Hensley went back to being Annie Hensley after being Annie Rolandi, and got remarried and had a family. So I started searching in that area of Birmingham for a marriage of an Annie Hensley in the next few years. They lived in the Handsworth and Smethwick areas of Birmingham, which is west of the city. And sure enough, a few years later, an Annie Hensley got married. On April the 6th, 1885, 7 years after the birth of Louis Peter Rolandi, an Anne Hensley got married. And notice, her father was Henry Hensley, a scrap dealer. And on the marriage record of Annie Hensley to Luigi Rolandi, her father was listed as Henry Hensley, a scrap dealer. What are the chances of there being two Henry Hensley scrap dealers living in that same small area of Birmingham, having a daughter, Anne or Annie, in the same year? It must be that Annie did not die in childbirth. My theory is that Anne did exactly that. She gave the baby to the grandparents, and she went back to her maiden name, Hensley. And a few years later, actually 7 years later, she married George Butler and had 7 children of her own and lived a happy life, very close to her child by Luigi Rolandi. In fact, for most of Louis Peter Rolandi's life, his mother was living within 2 miles of where he was living with his grandparents. So she probably visited. She probably visited regularly, watching him grow up. And he thought she was just a family friend, not knowing that she was his mother. The only way to definitively prove that this Anne Hensley is our Annie Hensley would be with the DNA of Michaela from Perth. If I could find a DNA match, a third or fourth cousin of hers with the last name Butler or from that Butler family, that would be definitive proof. So I contacted Michaela and I told her my theory and asked her if she would check her DNA for me. Well, she kindly shared her DNA with me. So I went through all her matches and put them into the family groups, the grandparent and great-grandparent groups. And there are a number of English relatives that I just don't know where they fit in, but none of them are close enough to be children of George and Annie. But I'm sure in time, one of their descendants will join Ancestry and send in their DNA, and then we will have proof that Annie Hensley never died in childbirth. And at this time, she mentioned one other thing. She said, by the way, I have this painting in my closet. My great-grandfather brought it with him from England. It's a portrait of his father or grandfather, the man who raised him. And it's just been sitting in my closet. Would you like it? So Michaela in Perth, Australia, sent me this painting. And it arrived in the mail, and it was not framed, so I had it framed, and it now hangs in my home. I have a painting, the portrait of Luigi Apollinari, born in Borgoval di Taro, who went to England and married Rose Vaughan and had the affair with Susan Agostini, and then went to Birmingham, where she gave birth to my great-grandfather, and he eventually died in West Bromwich. A painting of my great-great-grandfather, a man my own grandfather knew nothing about, and now it hangs in my home in Texas. This incredible gift from Michaela in Perth, Australia, was the perfect cherry on top of this entire investigation and saga. I had no idea that a painting even existed of any of the family. And clearly, old Luigi Apollinari Rolandi was fairly successful in his business if he could have afforded to have a portrait painted of himself. I now have pictures of my ancestors back to my great-great-grandfather, Luigi Rolandi, the portrait painting. I have a few photographs of Richard Charles Roberts in his later years, many photographs of my grandfather, Walter, and hundreds of photographs and videos of my dad, Vernon. And then there's me. This is our Y-DNA lineage. And that brings to an end my DNA saga. I started off thinking I'd be investigating the thoroughly English history of Richard Charles Roberts, and ended up investigating Italian Latin records from the 16th and 17th centuries in a tiny village in northern Italy for the Apollinari family. It's been an amazing experience, and throughout it all I've been stunned at the accuracy of the DNA. I've used DNA matches, ethnicity matches, and the through lines to find who these ancestors were, and it was mind-blowing. So all I have to say is finally, arrivederci cugini miei.